Hello friends, this is Mark Johnson. Welcome back to my series on TRIRIGA development. This is going to be part 3 of business objects. We are going to discuss fields in this particular lesson. We finished off last week on associations. So just a quick recap, an association is just a relationship between two objects, and we use strings to define those associations. So this is TRIRIGA 11.1 4.1. I'm going to go ahead and get logged in here. Now, the 11.2 4.2 release just came out, but I have not yet built a VM. And since I've started development in 11.1 I will continue to do the development for this particular series in that version. So we need to go back to the data modeler in order to be able to add fields to our business object. So under the object browser, come down to the CST Sports module and CST Sports. This is our first BO in this module again, which makes this the base BO, which is kind of unique in that everything that we add here will serve as a template for other records. Now, whenever you create a business object, you're going to want to have some standard fields on the business object. There's fields that are used kind of as a default or de facto standard, things like the try name TX, try description TX, your try status, your try previous status, classification fields, and then there's a bunch of different system fields. So if you're ever not really sure, I mean, one of the things that you can do is you can go in and take a look at some of the other business objects, for instance, like the system fields that we're going to add, right? So I can come up here and do a search on the sy suffix, because all of our fields we use a suffix for, which we'll discuss here in just a minute. But then I can kind of just scroll down and I can see, okay, there's a business object ID system field, the business object label system field, the business object name system field, right? The created system field, which is the not who created it, but the created date and time. The form ID, form label, form name system field, modified, which again, it's not who modified it, but the time. And then for hierarchy objects, you got things like parent ID and path, system fields, the project ID, the project name, because there is a concept of project containers that we haven't discussed that we will get to eventually. And so then the record ID, record name, record state, those are good things to have, because those are things that you can then either filter on in queries, or you can have workflow logic that's based off them. So if you ever forget which ones they are, just kind of go take a look and see, right? If you need to, take a look at a few different ones. So when it comes to adding fields, you can add new fields to your object, or you can find fields that exist. Now, you can only create a new field or add a new field if there is not already a field with that exact name that exists in the system, right? So if the field already exists somewhere in the system, then you need to use find, and then you can add the fields that way. So that's what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on find, and I'm going to do percent status CL for the name, which is our suffix. So in these search fields, you can use the standard, basically Oracle-based wildcards. So in this case, right, the percent, right? So anything that came before. So let's adjust our list size here so we can see more fields, because there's 22 of them, right? So in our previous videos, we went ahead and we added in the associations so that we can do our status and our previous status classifications. So I'm going to go ahead and click accept to bring those in. And then the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and set the type of field that I'm looking for to be system read only field. And if there's a particular business object or module or whatever, where you know the fields exist, you can set it and filter on that too. So I'm just going to go ahead and search and bring in the system fields. So uh, the common ones are, business object ID, business object label, business object name. So what'll happen is when with these fields, they're system fields, so that means that they'll get populated automatically by the system with the name of the business object, with the label of the business object, right, with the ID of the business object. Now, I go ahead and add the ID, but it's really not that useful. You're not really going to ever want to search based off the ID or filter based off of the ID or build logic based off the ID, right? Because the ID can differ from system to system based on the order in which the objects are created. So they could have the same label and name, but different IDs. So the ID loses some of its effectiveness, but I like to go ahead and add it, so that it's consistent from one object to another, even though that consistency isn't there in all of TRIRIGA. I try to be as consistent as possible so that, if you're in the habit of being able to grab the business object label or its name and use it in workflow, right, you should be able to do that from any business object. So that's why I always add these fields when I'm creating a new object. So the other things we saw, we had the created SY, the form ID, form label, form name. We don't need path because this is not a hierarchy object. The try modified system was another. And then we don't need path, it's not a hierarchy. So project ID and project name. And then record ID, record name, and record state. These are the most common system fields that you use. And we'll see that state and status are actually very closely related. We set statuses based off of our state, which you'll see when we get to doing the state family. So I've selected the fields that I want. I'm going to go ahead and select accept. I'm going to come back here to all, and I'm going to add the try name TX field. And the control number CN field. And then the last field that's kind of a standard, the try ID TX field. So you see, right, the search is not case sensitive. I can go ahead and add that. Now, each of these fields have properties, and you can see here as we added these fields, right, they have different suffixes. And so what it is there's a naming convention when it comes to creating fields, right, is that you want to be able to tell the type of data that that field holds based off of its name. So as you might expect, the fields that end with TX, like try name TX, those are text fields, right? So those fields are going to contain text. Number fields in with NU. The control number is a special type field, so it gets CN. But if you go to the app builder guide, you can see it is documented, right? There's a whole list here of what the different suffixes are for the different type of fields, right? Whether it's a date field or date time field, a duration field, financial roll-ups, images, right? Just a label, a list, note fields, number. You'll pretty much you know memorize these, right? You'll commit them to memory just by sheer, repetition and usage, over the years. When you're first starting out, it may be a little hard to remember, and so you might want to, make a little cheat sheet or something and have and keep this information so that you can go ahead and put the suffix in, because what you don't want to do is create the field without the suffix, because you forget. And we all do this. And then you go and you start hooking it up in places and forms and workflows and everything else, and then you realize that I don't have a suffix there, right? Well, once you create that field, you can't change its name. So you can't go in and fix it, right? You have to create a brand new field with the correct name, and then go and hook it up everywhere. Remove, the old field from being hooked up everywhere, and then you can finally, delete that old field. So again, the naming convention, right? This is just to tell us what type of data that field stores, so that as you're doing things like, workflow mapping and that sort of thing, you know what the value is. Now, each field has properties. So if I click on the field, I'm going to see its properties. And depending on the type of the field, the number of properties will change. And one field property that's the same everywhere is this do not auto populate. So what this particular property does for us is it says that, hey, if this field, when this record is very first created, right, if it doesn't have a default value for it, and this checkbox is not checked, then what it's going to do is it's going to go out and it's going to check the people record and see, is there a field with the same name on the people record? And if there is, it'll go ahead and it'll auto-populate. It'll copy the value that's on the people record down to our field on this record, right? Or if it's a hierarchy object, right, it'll pull it. It will also, check the parent object and pull the value from the parent object, right? That can be useful, and there certainly are a few times where you want that to happen, but really 99.999% of the time, you do not want those fields to auto-populate. So because of that, you want to always, always, always checkbox this do not auto-populate unless you know for sure you want this field to auto-populate. Now, these fields already exist in the system, and when they were created, they were not created with this do not auto-populate. So when it gets added onto whatever object you add the fields, it's not going to be set. So even though we've got these fields here now, we need to go back into each one and configure them, in order to do it right. So um, the other properties we see here required, right? It's very straightforward. Like I say, it means that a value has to be entered in here, right? Well, this is a system field. The system automatically sets the value. So it doesn't really make sense to make it required because it will have a value. It won't ever be blank. And then we have a few more field properties here that we'll get into. So these other field properties you're not really going to utilize very often. So there's this result column, and you can see you can't actually select it. It is grayed out. But what that particular field property does is it says whether the field can be used in smart sections or not, or a dynamic list is a list that actually gets built from the record values of a particular object. And so only those fields that have the result column checked are available to be selected when creating the dynamic list. So you can, if you're ever not sure what some of these properties do because you don't use them very often, again, go back to the app builder guide, and you can go and you can look up and you can see, okay, here's what result column does, right? Um, and you'll see here, right? If it's checked, right, then you get another field property, which is a column sequence number, right, which determines the order in which the fields appear in the smart sections, right? Well, we can't check it for me to show you, right? And then the next field beneath it is the mobile field here, right? And you can see, right, that this checkbox is useful for mobile applications that run clients that have small displays, right? So the setting of this box determines whether the field is included in the smaller view or not, right? So this mobile setting is relatively it's relatively new, at least in my time in TRIRIGA. So let's go ahead and move that back off the screen. But that's what the mobile field does. The do audit. So on business objects, we discussed in the BO properties, there's an auditing property. right? And you can set it to where you can track changes in individual fields. So if this is a field that I want to track the changes in, I can select the do audit. Because it is a system field, it is automatically selected as being read-only, because again, the system populates it, the user doesn't populate it, and you cannot deselect that, right? And then with system fields, there is a sub-attribute type which tells what the value the system's going to populate into it. So in this case, it's going to take the BO type ID, which is just the business object ID. So because we said this just do not auto-populate, we need to save this field, and we want to go into each additional field here that we added and go ahead and save that. So I'm just going to do that real quick, because again, you always want to set this. If you do not, then you set yourself up to have some crazy troubleshooting at some point. I've been bitten by this before, to where I have forgot to set the do not auto populate, and when I created a record, it got populated with a value that I was not expecting, and then I proceeded then to waste a few hours time trying to figure out, well, where did that value come from, because you'll go into your workflow builder, and you'll look in your instances, and you'll check your mappings, and you'll look for it, and it's not going to be there, right? And you're going to spin your wheels and waste a lot of time uh, when it's there, because it auto populated, right? And for some of it, um, it makes sense to not be there, which reminds me, there's a field that I forgot to add, so I'm going to go ahead and pop over and find. So the I modified by TX. All right, let's expand this out. So this try modified by TX, this is a very common field that's on all the business objects, and it's used to um, to set who modified the object, right? We recorded in there. So unfortunately, with it, if we go and see, right, the do not auto populate's not set, and so this actually would kind of cause a problem, right? So by having this do not auto populate not set, when you create a record, right, then instead of your name being set into the field, which is what you would expect for the modified by, because you're the person modifying it, it would actually copy the value from the modified by on your people record. So whoever modified your people record last, their information would then get put into the modified by TX, right? So it could be, problematic. So the platform team at one point, to cut down on this particular issue, they took a novel way of trying to resolve this, which I don't think was the correct way, right? Because instead of going into every field and modifying every BO and modifying this field and then saving it and publishing the BO and then having to have all the different BOs, right, in the upgrade, they instead just made it to where this field does not automatically populate. It throws an error in the server log instead. So it generates a ton of noise in the server log from this field attempting to be auto-populated. And so the way you prevent that noise in the server log is you have to set this do not auto-populate. So if I'm customizing a business object, I always automatically just kind of go in and set that field, save it. So let's just look at a few of the other fields here. This is a text field, so we do have a few additional values. A staging table field. So if this is going to be used in a staging table, we would checkbox this field to make it available. If the staging table key, right, this right now we can't select it because it's not a staging table field. So we would have to select this first, and then we would be able to determine whether it's a key, right? The key means that it's one of the field or combination of fields that makes or identifies a record as being unique, right? So whatever those fields are that make a record unique, you'd want to set the staging table key value on. Localizable, that's for language translations, right? Read-only is kind of self-explanatory. Default value, right? So any field that has a default value, if you set the default value, then it doesn't, then this auto-populate setting doesn't matter, right? Because it's going to get populated with the default value. It's not going to go and auto-populate. So even if I'm setting a default value, I always check this. Again, I practice what I call, defensive programming, or it's, risk management based, programming. If I'm just always in the habit of doing something, then chances of me not doing it when I need to is much less than if I'm in the habit of doing something only sometimes, right? So doing something only sometimes, greater chance of not doing it, therefore greater risk, right? Always doing it, much lower risk. Right? So if you keep doing your development in ways to minimize risk, that protects you and helps you, because over time, as you do enough development and that percentage, right, it's going to hit, it's going to come up, and Mr. Murphy's going to jump in there and stick his thumb in things. So just best to always follow and set the do not auto-populate. The default value is self-explanatory. The validation, you can do some validation, right? I can, it can only be lowercase. It can only, or it has, or it will only be uppercase, right? It can only be, alphanumeric but no spaces, right? Or it can only be numbers, right? So you're using a string kind of as a number. The size of the field, how many characters can I fit? And then locator field. A locator field is just a field which allows you to point to a field on another object, right? And so what that does is it brings in the value from that other object and populates it into your field, but then it also creates a link to that object, right? So there will be a hyperlink that you can click on, just like there's a hyperlink here on description, right? You can click on that field and it would open up that target record. So there are some things that we can do with locator fields, and we'll discuss them a little more later. But you can bring over and you can map some additional field values. Now it's just a copy of whatever those field values at the time you're setting it. It does not keep them in sync at all, right? That's what we use smart sections for, which again is something else we'll discuss later. The locator fields do require an association, so we would want to go and create that association to the object first, right? So that when we go to build our locator field, it's there, and then a formula, right? So we can do simple formulas, which you can just do, add, subtract, that sort of thing. So if I do accept and then add, right? So in this case, it's a text field, so it's going to be concatenation. If it's a number field, we'll be able to do just multiply, add, subtract, divide, um, just basic things. So let me go ahead and clear this. We're going to go ahead and save our field so that our do not auto-populate is here, and I'm going to pause the recording real quick while I go through here and set the rest of the do not auto-populate. So I'll be right back for you guys. Okay, I have finished. Go ahead and added the do not auto-populate to all of my fields here. I do want to discuss a couple of the other field properties, and then also with the do not auto-populate, one of the common things or exceptions that I see is somebody will create a new custom field, so they'll prefix it, CST. So which is what you want to do is you're creating new custom fields is CST. Um, they'll not set the do not auto populate because they're going, well, this is a custom field and it doesn't exist on the people object, so I'm not at any risk, which is all true and well and good. The problem is there's not a field with that name on the people object yet or at this period of time, right? But that doesn't mean there will never be. So if somebody goes and they add a field with that name to the people object for whatever reason, well, now you've got a valid auto mapping source and it will auto populate down, right, and can cause you some headaches and some problems, right? Where if you just always set this field, you'll never get the problem. Whether somebody adds that value in or not. So that's why I say, again, it's about risk management, right? If I always set this, then it doesn't matter if somebody else goes and adds that field or not, or it shows up, by the product team, whatever reason, right? In the future, I'm kind of future proof, right? Where if I leave this unchecked, I'm not future proof, right? If it ever gets added, then I've got a potential problem, right? So again, if you continue to minimize risk, you'll be much more successful, right? And you can be like, I am, where I've never been part of a failed project, right? Because, this attention to detail and always trying to mitigate risk. So that's enough about the do not auto populate. We've got two fields here, this description and purpose. And you can see they're kind of different than the rest of the fields, right? Because it's grayed out. I can't I can't type into either one of these. So how do they get their values? So you saw that there is a link here. And so the reason why these particular properties get edited differently is because these two properties are not unique for each instance of the field in the system, right? This description and this purpose is carried out or goes across all the fields in the system or all the instances of this field in the system, right? So I can change the description or the purpose, right? And so as they've done here, right, they put in a purpose, right? So we're branching and workflows for BIOS to have multiple GUIs, right? You want to be able, like if you have logic that you only want to run against the building and not the structure, right? You can check the form label or the form name, right? See which form it is, and then apply your logic accordingly. So if I click on the description, it's going to pop up down here. So down here is where I can make changes to the description, the purpose, and click OK. But again, right, this is system wide. It's not just for this one instance of the field. So you can't put unique purposes and unique descriptions in um, for your particular instance. So just bear that in mind. It does kind of limit the effectiveness of some of these fields. All right, so let's go ahead and get down to the fields that we wanted to create, which is just our classification fields, because we created our associations. So again, a lot of these are the same, right? The result column, mobile field, staging table key, the auditing, the read only. So the classification, the root classification that our classification field points to. In this case, it's already set, right? Because this field exists, so it's set to the status classification. So our association string is current status. So whenever this classification field gets set, it'll also create this association using the current status. So I'm going to go ahead and save and go to previous status, and I will select previous status. All right, so as it stands now, we've got our status classifications, we've got our standard system fields, we've got our standard text fields, ID, name, um, then the control number. So these are all values and things that we want to have, um, and we'll use on each of the other business objects that we create. So at this point, I don't think there's any other fields that I want to add to this particular business object. There are some additional business objects that I want to create, and then we'll add some individual fields to them. But for now, this concludes the session on the field properties and adding fields to a business object. Again, there's a whole section or chapter in the App Builder Guide, on fields. You can look up the different field properties, kind of learn what things are. For whatever reason, a lot of developers, they kind of forget about the Builder Guide and, kind of just try to either learn on the fly or start, asking other people when you should, familiarize yourself with the Builder Guide. Well, I hope you guys are enjoying and liking or finding helpful these videos. As always, please do like to subscribe to the channel if you want to continue to see videos be created. Please subscribe. That's the only real measure that I have to tell if people are finding these worthwhile or not. Because honestly, if they're not really appreciated or liked, then I'm not going to continue to making them. There are many other side projects that I would like to devote my time to, and things and tools to build and that sort of stuff. So please like and subscribe. There are 180 subscribers already, so I do thank you for that. And if you have questions or comments, please feel free to reach out and either leave the comments on the channel, or you can also message me directly on LinkedIn, or communicate with me in the TRIRIGA conversations group. Thank you.